There is a name that never appeared on the final list, not because it was removed, but because it was never written down in the first place. A private promenade suite, reserved on the largest ship ever built, sat empty as it left Southampton in April 1912, and the man who owned both the suite and the vessel was nowhere on board. J.P.P. Morgan had booked his place, his physician had booked his place, several of his closest associates had done the same, and then, in the final days before departure, one by one, they withdrew. The official explanation was illness, yet within the same week, photographs surfaced in France showing Morgan in excellent health, relaxed, unhurried, as if nothing had been interrupted at all. On that same ship, 3 other men boarded without hesitation: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, 3 of the most powerful independent financiers in America, each with the resources, the networks, and the influence to resist something that had already been quietly drafted in a private meeting 2 years earlier, far from public view. They all sailed. None returned. We are told the Titanic was a tragedy of ice, speed, and miscalculation, a catastrophic alignment of human error and natural conditions, fully explained, fully documented, and ultimately unavoidable. But when you place the passenger list beside the timeline that followed, something begins to shift, something subtle but impossible to ignore. Because less than 2 years later, in December 1913, a financial system was passed into law during a near-empty session of Congress, a system that required, above all else, the absence of men exactly like the ones who had just disappeared beneath the North Atlantic. So the question is not simply what happened that night. The question is, why did it happen, exactly when it did? There is a version of early 20th century America that is easy to accept, a version where wealth existed, but remained fragmented, independent, and difficult to control. The so-called Gilded Age is often framed as a period of excess, of inequality, of unchecked accumulation, yet that description quietly removes the one detail that matters most. The wealth was not centralized. It did not answer to a unified authority. It could refuse. That ability to refuse, to stand outside a coordinated financial system, is what made certain men uniquely significant as the year 1910 approached. Not because they were radicals, not because they opposed progress, but because they represented something structurally incompatible with what had already begun to take shape behind closed doors. In November 1910, on Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private meeting was held under conditions that were deliberately concealed. Attendees traveled under assumed names, avoiding public recognition, avoiding documentation that could later be traced. Among them were Senator Nelson Aldrich, representatives tied to the Rockefeller banking interests, and agents connected to the Morgan and Kuhn Loeb financial networks. This was not a public discussion. It was not a legislative session. It was the drafting of a system. It was the draft. The proposal that emerged from that meeting was not simply about creating stability. It was about constructing a central mechanism, a privately influenced structure that could coordinate, expand, and ultimately control the American money supply. Such a system required more than agreement. It required the absence of resistance, not casual disagreement, but organized, well-funded opposition capable of sustaining pressure across multiple legislative cycles. This is where the alignment begins to form. John Jacob Astor IV was not just wealthy, he was the wealthiest individual in the United States, with a fortune that would exceed $2 billion in modern terms. At 47 years old, in April 1912, he was not retiring, not withdrawing, but actively positioned at the center of influence, with both the capital and the credibility to challenge structural change. Benjamin Guggenheim represented a different form of power, rooted in extraction, in the physical resources that fueled industrial expansion. Silver, copper, lead, the materials that made infrastructure possible. His voice within that network was not symbolic. It was operational. Isidor Straus added something else entirely: political reach. As a former member of the House of Representatives and co-owner of RHA, Macy and Company, his influence extended into both commerce and governance, into the relationships that turn opposition into coordinated action. 3 men, 3 distinct pillars of independent American capital, and each one occupied a position that could not easily be replaced. When they boarded the Titanic in April 1912, they carried more than personal wealth. They carried the capacity to resist, to fund, to organize, and to delay a system that depended on their absence to move forward without obstruction. What happened next is recorded as an accident, but what followed moved with remarkable precision. J.P. Morgan understood the structure of power in America with a level of clarity few others possessed. Through his International Mercantile Marine Trust, he had acquired the White Star Line in the early 1900s, placing the Titanic, in the most literal corporate sense, under his ownership. The ship was designed, financed, and insured within a network he controlled. Constructed at Harland and Wolff in Belfast, and prepared for a maiden voyage that would carry some of the most influential individuals of the time. Morgan had reserved a private promenade suite, his physician had secured passage. Several of his close associates were scheduled to be on board. Then, in the final days before departure, cancellations began to appear, not gradually, not as isolated decisions, but in sequence. Morgan withdrew, his physician withdrew. The explanation was consistent: illness. Yet within days of the ship's departure from Southampton on April 10, 1912, Morgan was photographed in France, not confined, not recovering, but active, composed, and visibly in excellent health. The official explanation remained unchanged, but the visual record suggested something else entirely, something that did not require interpretation, only comparison. The Titanic carried his three most financially significant counterparts across its first-class manifest. Astor boarded at Cherbourg and was assigned Suite 62. Guggenheim boarded with his valet. Straus boarded with his wife Ida. Each had a reason to return to New York. Each had ongoing interests, obligations, and influence that extended beyond a single journey. None survived. The official inquiries that followed focused on the mechanics of the disaster. Ice warnings had been received and acknowledged. The ship maintained a speed of approximately 22 knots on the night of April 14th, moving through waters that had already been identified as dangerous. The binoculars intended for the crow's nest lookouts were locked in a storage cabinet, the key taken by a crew member who had left the ship at Southampton and was never replaced. The men assigned to watch for ice were left with only their vision, scanning darkness at speed, without the tools designed to extend it. Captain Edward Smith, nearing the end of a long and distinguished career, did not reduce speed in response to the warnings. The decision was later described as imprudent, not cautious, not defensible. It was a choice that remained within the bounds of human error, yet when combined with every other detail, it began to form a pattern that felt less like randomness and more like alignment. 12 miles away, another ship, the Californian, had stopped for the night due to ice. Her captain, Stanley Lord, had chosen caution. Around 12:45 in the morning, members of the Californian's crew observed rockets rising from a vessel in the distance. Distress signals, not one, but multiple. The reports were delivered to Captain Lord. He acknowledged them. And then, nothing. The Californian did not move. The failure of the Californian to respond has never been resolved in a way that satisfies the record. The rockets were seen, described, and logged. They were recognized as signals, discussed among officers, and ultimately left unanswered. Both the American Senate inquiry and the British Board of Trade later concluded that Captain Stanley Lord's inaction was indefensible, yet no criminal charges followed, no formal revocation of his credentials, only decades of letters written by a man attempting to explain why a ship that could have intervened remained still. He claimed the vessel observed was not the Titanic, that the rockets were misinterpreted, that distance made certainty impossible. These explanations were entered into the record, but they did not erase the central detail. A ship in distress signaled for help. Another ship saw those signals, and the distance between them was never crossed. At the same time, another line of inquiry began to surface, not in official hearings, but among those who studied the physical and financial conditions surrounding the disaster. The Olympic, a sister ship to the Titanic, had suffered a significant collision in September 1911 with the British warship Hum's Hawk. The damage was severe, the repairs extensive, and the insurance claim that followed was denied after the Admiralty Court ruled the fault lay with the Olympic. This created a problem. The White Star Line had invested heavily in a vessel that could not recover its losses through insurance. The Olympic became a liability, a repaired ship carrying the financial weight of an unresolved claim. The Titanic, by contrast, was fully insured, newly completed, and represented, on paper, far greater value if lost under covered conditions than if operated under normal service. From this discrepancy, a theory emerged, not proven but persistent, that the two ships may have been altered, exchanged, or presented in a way that obscured their true identity. Workers from Harland and Wolff later pointed to hull markings that seemed inconsistent. Photographs of the propellers taken before departure were analyzed, with some researchers suggesting they did not match the documented specifications of the Titanic. A surviving crew member, Violet Jessop, who had been aboard both the Olympic during its collision and the Titanic during its sinking, later wrote of subtle inconsistencies, a sense that certain details did not align perfectly with official descriptions. These are not confirmed facts, they are observations, fragments that have never been fully resolved, existing at the edge of the documented narrative. What is confirmed does not require speculation. The speed, the missing binocular key, the ignored ice warnings, the unanswered rockets, each element individually explainable, collectively forming something more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And beneath all of it, another detail persists, less technical, but equally revealing. Among the cargo rumors circulating as early as 1912 was the story of a mummified Egyptian priestess, said to be associated with a series of misfortunes that followed its owners. The British Museum denied its presence categorically, and continues to do so. Yet the rumor endured, not because of evidence, but because of what it reflected. A sense, among those closest to the event, that something about the voyage was wrong. The official conclusion did not change. Ice, speed, lifeboat shortages, and communication failures, each documented, each sufficient on its own to explain a disaster of that scale. The inquiries produced findings that were internally consistent, technically accurate, and widely accepted. Yet none of those findings addressed what happened after the water closed, because while the wreckage settled at the bottom of the North Atlantic, something else began to move with unusual efficiency on land. In Washington, through the remainder of 1912 and into the following year, the framework that had been drafted in secrecy at Jekyll Island began to pass steadily through the legislative process. It did not stall. It did not collapse under scrutiny. It advanced. By December 23, 1913, during a session of Congress that was notably diminished due to the Christmas recess, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. The Senate approved it. The House approved it. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law that same evening. The system that had required the absence of powerful, well-funded opposition was now permanent. The timing is not debated. The sequence is not hidden. November 1910, the plan is drafted in private, under false names, by representatives of major financial interests. April 1912, three of the most influential independent opponents of centralized financial control board, a ship owned by one of the men connected to that framework. The ship sinks. None of those three men survive. December 1913, the system becomes law. March 1914, the Federal Reserve banks open. From that point forward, the structure of American finance begins to change in ways that are incremental, but irreversible. The gold standard, which had functioned as a constraint on unlimited currency issuance, begins to erode. In 1933, gold convertibility is suspended under Roosevelt. In 1971, it is ended entirely under Nixon. Each step follows the previous one, each dependent on the existence of the system created in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act did not simply establish a central bank. It transferred the authority to issue American currency away from the United States Treasury and placed it within a network of regional reserve banks, institutions owned by member banks, private entities operating within a coordinated structure. The same class of institutions that had designed the system now operated it. What is missing from this sequence is not a document, not a statement, not a recorded objection. What is missing is the capacity to resist. Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus did not need to publish manifestos. Their influence existed in their ability to fund opposition, to organize resistance, to sustain pressure over time. After April 1912, that capacity no longer existed. Not weakened, gone. There is no document that proves intent, no single piece of paper that states what happened was planned, and that absence is often presented as the final answer, the reason the story should end exactly where the official record stops. But history does not only exist in what is written. It exists in sequence, in timing, in the quiet alignment of events that, when placed side by side, begin to suggest something more than coincidence. Three men with the capacity to resist, gone in April 1912, a system that required their absence passed into law in December 1913. A structure that would go on to redefine control over currency, over credit, over the economic direction of an entire nation, established without the kind of opposition that would have been expected under normal conditions. The record is complete, and yet something about it feels unfinished, because the question was never asked in the moment it mattered. Not why the ship struck the ice, not why the lifeboats were insufficient, but why the conditions that made resistance possible disappeared just before resistance would have been required. And if that sequence was not an accident, then what else, buried in the same era, followed a pattern we were never meant to notice?